listening to the Taming Hindrances podcast, conversations about self-awareness and mental health. We talk about anything and everything on the podcast. Real experiences, real life. Come get triggered. Welcome to another episode of the Taming Hindrances podcast. My name's Phil. I'm the host and creator of the podcast. And today's topic of discussion is self. I mean, I talk about self-awareness and mental health here on the podcast. So I think it's about time we get into the conversation of self. And along with self, we have to have the conversation of the word ego or ego. In Latin, ego, ego, means I. And we often talk about how someone can be egotistical or, someone has a big ego or those types of things. So as always, I like to start with definitions. We'll start with two definitions here real quick. We'll define self. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines self as an individual's typical character or behavior, an individual's temporary behavior or character, a person in prime condition, the union of elements such as body, emotions, thoughts, and sensations that can constitute the individuality and identity of a person. If we've talked about individuality and identity before, and then also, personal interest or advantage. Yeah, it goes on and on and on. We can even get into the pronouns, and that's a touchy subject in today's society. But the objective, the adjective of self, having a single character or quality throughout. That's, so something can have self in that sense, something could be a color or, a tone, those types of things. Moving on into ego, which I think is a little bit more of the focus here, because when we talk about self-awareness and we talk about, metaphysics and all of the different mystery schools out there, there's always this conversation about the ego, which I always pronounce as ego because I have a little bit of a different background on how I learned about ego. But we'll get into that in a bit. So the biggest word ever used for ego is egotism. And first, the definition of ego or ego is the self, especially or as contrasted with another self or the world. So let me one more time here. The self, especially as contrasted with another self or the world. So we define self. Ego is, it's in contrast to. It is the I. It is the individual. It is the identity of the one, the singular, not the plural. And I've talked a lot recently on the podcast about how we as a collective have given rise to the collective, right? And that's a problem in my eyes. Last episode when I talked about humanity, I shouldn't say last episode. The episode on humanity, I talk about how we've given our voices to the collective. We've given everything over to the collective, defining who we are as a species, who we are as an individual. Everything is based on this idea of the collective, the group mentality, the society, those types of things. And we've lost touch with the individual. We've lost touch with ego. Now, there's egotism, and it has a negative connotation to it. Someone who's being egotistical, those types of things. It's the excessive use of the first person singular personal pronoun or the practice of talking about oneself too much. That's the definition of egotism. It's not the definition of ego. And I think a lot of people fall into an unfortunate situation where they think ego's bad. They think the idea of self is bad because we talk about egotism. We talk about someone being egotistical, the very way too bravado type person, the person that talks about themselves all the time, the person that's constantly, hyping themselves up and only is all about themselves. And listen, I get it. You don't want to be that person. No one wants to be that person. We talk about it constantly in today's society about, don't be that person. Don't talk about yourself all the time or be selfish all the time and to an extent, right? Everything must have balance. That's the universal rule, and balance is done by asymmetry. I talked about that before and how the duality is actually triality. So when we talk about that, what is the triality of self? What is I? What is ego? Ego being, from the Latin derivative, it means I, it means self. Well, that is complex, and I've tried to cover multiple different pieces on what makes up self. That being said, to bring it into a little bit of a simpler light, let's start with the idea that self is the triality of you. And that triality is based on the duality. Remember, all dualistic, all duality, all those things in metaphysics, when we talk about duality, dualism, those things, it's actually triality. It's the two sides to one coin. Well, the two sides to the same coin are the physical, the material world we live in, and the non-physical, the spiritual world we live in. You can call it other, spiritual, whatever you want to call it. Side real, things we don't know about, those types of things. It's two. It's material and that. The things we can interact with and touch and do in physics and science and all that stuff, and then all the stuff that metaphysics and all that metasciences and, extrasensorial data and all that stuff, that world. Well, that's the dual. What's the triality of it? The triality is the mind. And I've talked about this before with, etheric physics, but specifically with alchemy and the alchemists, someone like Paracelsus, even Thoth, other writers, actually just about every major philosophical writer gets into it at some point, I believe, or at least a piece of it. They talk about the multiple health bodies. Really, alchemy as a whole talks about the multiple health bodies, where you have the physical health body, your physical form, the world in materiam, your cells and all the different pieces, the cardiovascular system, the nervous system, the digestive system, endocrine system, all the different systems of the body, brain and tissue and, nails and hair and skin and eyes and that whole body. That's the physical form. That's the vessel, if you want to talk about iamblichus, the vessel of the soul. You want to talk about Eckhart Tolle and how, really this is just a thing. It's just there's this consciousness and then there's a body and they're separate and the multilistic differentiations. And then, there's the spiritual body, the energetic bodies, and all these other things. And most people shy away from those conversations, mostly because we don't understand them. And we really haven't spent the time recently in today's modern society, or quote unquote modern, to really study it, to look at it. And the reason we haven't done that, in my personal opinion, is because there's a bunch of breathy guru douchebags out there who ruined it for everybody. They read old metaphysical texts. They didn't understand them. They decided that, no one understands this stuff, so I'm going to come up with my own way of, expressing it to others, and I'm going to make money off of it. And I'm not saying you can't do that, but you need to be able to do it accurately and do it specifically and actually have basis of understanding. And most of them did it and didn't. And we ended up with a bunch of people that I call breathy guru douchebags who know nothing of what they're talking about and have just spun the real old antiquity, ancient research of the human system in all three of these bodies into bullshit. And they sold it to people. I'm going to do a seance and roll around in my yard and tell you what your dog is feeling. If you want to pay those people, sure, go right ahead. I don't really care. You're just giving money into the world of stupidity. I'm not saying, though, at this point, I'm not saying someone can't figure out what your dog is feeling or can't do a seance or all of these other extrasensorial things. I wholeheartedly believe that, yes, this is all possible. But the practitioners who are taking your money to do these things need to be held in regard of most of them are lying. Most of them have no idea what they're talking about. And this even gets into yoga practice. Most yogis, quote unquote yogis, are full of shit. I'm sorry I'm calling you out, yoga world, but I'm calling you out. That's what I do. I'm calling you out because you've allowed individuals to create systems that are just BS. And you just let it run rampant without calling them out, without stopping them. And, the real practitioners out there, the real people have real understanding, the people who really understand what it is to be yogic or the practice of yoga, which is one piece of Ayurvedic medicine, one piece of a whole system. didn't stop the people from creating these other BS systems and touting themselves as these great yogi masters. And, no one calls them a guru. What would be considered a guru doesn't call themselves a guru. That's not, if you go back and you look at how this works, that's not a real word for someone. A guru is a derogative term in the ancient texts. You don't want to be a guru. That's a derogative term. You don't want to be that person. That's like what I call, when I say breathy guru douchebags. That idea of guruism is not good. It's not necessarily negative, but it's really just not great. It's self-proclaimed. It's egotistical. That's the negative side there. It's this selfishness to be a guru. If others call you a guru, that's a little different. It's kind of like in martial arts, I'd be known as a Sifu. I gained a certain amount of knowledge. I tested. I achieved a certain level of ranking that allowed me to teach. At one point in time, I had a letter of applications that I had a written form, little piece of paper that said, yeah, this guy's allowed to teach this system and this system and this system. And even that was all political and whatever. Get into it another time. But that was me becoming a Sifu. And in the Japanese side of things, it would have been a sensei. And there's different names for the name for instructor or teacher. What I was not was a master. Because you cannot self-proclaim yourself as a master in the martial systems, in the martial arts systems, really. Martialism is different. I've spoken about that before. But in the martial arts systems, no individual can say, I'm a master of this. That's not what happens. You can say you are a degreed rank of, or a Sifu or a sensei, you're an instructor. I was an instructor, To be a Sifu, you must instruct. That is part of the process, is to gain a certain ranking of a belt and then to actually teach lower ranks. That's what makes you a Sifu. That's what makes you an instructor. Because that's really what the word means, teacher, essentially. Same thing for sensei. You can't just be a sensei without teaching. Now, I'm a former Sifu. No one calls me Sifu anymore because I don't teach anymore. It's not what I do. I've attained the rank and ability to do so, but I don't teach, so I'm not really a Sifu anymore. Now I've gotten that out of the way. Going back to the guru thing, from that aspect, in the martial arts systems, no one calls themselves a master. If you run into someone in a martial arts system who's like, I'm a master of, and no one else calls them a master, they're not a master of shit. You must be ranked as a certain level, attain a certain amount of knowledge, teach enough, and then produce others of such a high ranking that then you must become a master. That was the idea of becoming a master. In some cases, in old Chinese literature, mastering something, which is actually, I think it's been more modernized, but there's the 10,000 hour rule and that type of stuff. So there's these, systematic ideas of how to become a master. The reality though of the martial arts systems was, in order to become a master, other people claimed that for you. You didn't claim it for yourself. You were proclaimed a master by the group. That was the reality of it. So this idea that people called themselves gurus, that's why it has a negative context, because no one calls themselves a master who really is a master. You must be appointed to be so, to be labeled thereas. Someone who calls themselves, here's a good analogy. Someone who calls themselves a celebrity nowadays without actually being proclaimed as a celebrity by the masses is not a celebrity of anything. Okay. I can't just be like, I'm a celebrity. I can say that, but it's not true. And it's just an egotistical statement. It's an aphorism of just bad, right? There is an actual negative connotation to that. You don't want to trust these people. They're just so selfish and just, there's no idea of interaction with others, because that's what is required to become a master or to, have that quality. So calling out the yoga world, there's this whole idea that they invented this idea of gurus, and really guru is a Western idea. It's not a part of the Eastern teachings, the Ayurvedic teachings, there was no idea of a guru. Again, a guru was a negative connotation of someone who's self-proclaimed. And often there was the idea of harems and some bad shit. So cult-like stuff. So the idea of guru-ness, not good. We allowed that to happen. Okay. Well, what else happened? In that, we allowed for people to create a system of known as yoga here in the Western world that has nothing to do with actual yogic practice. Yogic practice as a whole begins with the idea of self-awareness, understanding oneself through breathing and meditation practice. Remember, all meditation is breathing, so really just breathing practice, or meditation thereof, interchangeable. And then there's this system of movement, and not even really movement, it's a system of poses that goes into creating a better health body, a better physical form, a better physical self. That actually transfers over into the world of Tai Chi, because those same positions and poses from the Brahmic understandings when the Buddha moved across into China, brought along the system, and the Chinese mind turned it and flowed it, because that's what the Chinese mind does. It gives flow to things. And we turned it into the practice of Tai Chi. That's why you find a lot of the Tai Chi poses are very similar to the yogic poses. They're not different systems. They come from the same basis of these poses that activate acupressure points, open up the different channels of the body from the understanding of the health systems we had back then, and still to this day work. I mean, we obviously knew what we were talking about, because yoga and Tai Chi and all these different health practices of stretching and these types of things do benefit the human system, the physical material world body. So it is a practice of self. That's part of it was the Ayurvedic practice of self-physical nature. That's one piece of the Ayurvedic medicine, just one piece. And we turned it into, in the Western world, this idea of being a yogi, and that has something to do with communing with nature and being very, nature-oriented, and not really. Sorry, yoga is a Western practice. It's a Western idea. It has ideas and roots from Ayurvedic medicine, Ayurvedic practices that come from, the Indian subcontinent and culture and that whole idea, and Hindu cultures. And remember, Hinduism is the way of the Hindu people. That system existed far before yoga. Yoga became popular when people traveled there from the Western world, realized there was some amazing ideas here, and then brought them back and then manipulated the Western mind, because they've realized that the Western mind at least hadn't gone to that extent yet. They hadn't gone into the world of metaphysics and studying the ethereal body and the energy bodies. And, we were just physical by form. That's why yoga became so popular as a Western practice, because it worked with the physical system. They left out all of the other stuff, the breathing. Many yoga practitioners, it's getting better. I will say it's getting better. I know I called out yoga practitioners. Not all of you. Some of you are great. It's getting better. But if a yoga practitioner or a yoga instructor, I should say, doesn't teach their practitioners breathing, that's not a full system. And it has nothing to do with the original system, because the original system started with breathing before any of the other stuff. You had to learn how to breathe, because once you get into these crazy poses, you need to know how to breathe correctly to make it all work. Breathing into the abdominal, breathing into different limbs, and breathing into the relaxation breaths of really relaxing into the pose, relaxing into the stretch, allowing the stretch to lengthen itself, allowing the myofascial system time to get into what's known as a myofascial stretch, which happens anywhere from 60 to 120 seconds after the stretch is initiated. Typically, the average human is somewhere around, I think, 75 to 80 seconds, but really 90 is a good market for, if you want to get into a myofascial stretch, about 90 seconds is where you want to hold it. And then after that is an actual myofascial stretch, and that has therapeutic change and therapeutic qualities because we're working with the fascial system, which till most recently the Western world didn't even know about. Dr. G.M. Bartow, which is who I studied, gave us the original understanding of the fascial system that we use in the Western world, or at least are starting to now. And that was 30 some years ago that he started his work. So that's why I call out that. And it's a representation of that idea of egotism versus ego. Okay. Martial arts systems, yoga systems. If the system was corrupted, I can't blame the practitioners because they didn't know. I'm going to call it out right now. Bikram yoga. Bikram was a piece of shit. That guy was a piece of shit. He was a guru. He was a self-proclaimed creepy harem birthday guru douchebag. That being said, people love Bikram yoga, but they need to get rid of that name because it's associated with an asshole, and they need to refresh that. But they can't because he marketed it and he used the Western system of incorporation and all that crap to create that. So yeah, that's the dangerous part of it. What does this have to do with self and ego? Well, when we talk about self, those are good representations to understand that there is a differentiation between ego, self, I, and the overabundance thereof, the bravado, the self-proclaimed guru, the things you want to stay away from. Alan Watts, if you've never listened to Alan Watts, I highly recommend his talks that he's given. And you can find most of this. I'm just going to throw a shameless plug in because I always forget to do it. Please head over to the website, taminghindrances.com, or the home of the podcast, and go to the archive page. The archive page has most of this stuff in some fashion. Sometimes I forget to put things on there, but generally I try to update it as much as possible. We try to update as much as possible and throw things on there that I talk about here in the podcast. And one of those is Alan Watts, and it'll take you to some of his works. And I think the Alan Watts website's on there where you can you can just go on YouTube and check for Alan Watts' speech. He gave a lot of great talks. And one of the things he's pretty famous for saying is the most egotistical thing you can do is try to eliminate the ego. Try to eliminate self. Try to eliminate I. That's egotistical to do. To try to kill off yourself. That's an egotistical practice. I've said before in this podcast that suicide is a selfish practice. Now, I've said also that there's always a reason, okay? And go back to the depression episode and the death episode and even the life episode and go through all those. But it is a selfish practice to do that. Now, that being said, it is that way based on that terminology of the most egotistical thing you can do is try to eliminate the ego. The most selfish thing you can do is to kill yourself. That is a very selfish act. And I give no connotation to it if it's right or wrong. That is up to the individual to decide. I'm not touting you should go commit suicide. No, that's not what I'm saying. In fact, if you've listened to anything I've said, it's the fact that you probably don't have enough information if suicide is your choice. You probably haven't been given the faculties or the ability to work out the situation in which you're living in, and that you haven't been given enough information to define your reality and to build your own identity, to have enough understanding to say that you've exhaustively looked at all options. That's usually how I go about that discussion. But this discussion is about self and ego. So let's move on a little bit. So we have the three health bodies. And going back to the duality and the triality, there's the physical, the me, the materium, the I of what we typically refer to as I in the Western world. And sometimes in old practice in the Eastern world, there's the physical form. And then we have the other, the spiritual, the energy bodies, the sidereal, the ethereal, all of those things that we don't really talk about much. And had a very good understanding of in antiquity. Multiple systems of understanding, Ayurvedic medicine, Chinese traditional medicine. Reiki is more modern, but comes from an idea of ki practice, which is ancient by nature. alchemy, Paracelsus and his practice of medicine, all sorts of different practice. The Native American, which is really just Americans, because that whole idea of native, whatever. Their practice of, that, if you go into South America with, the shamans, the spiritual leaders of just about any culture. So we had a really good understanding of all these things, and we've shied away from it over time due to the idea of coming up with things like Christianity and organized religions and saying that all that other stuff was bad and you should really only believe this. I've talked about that before and how I personally feel about that. Make up your own minds. But so you have physical, non-physical, and then you have the triality. There is the middle piece, and that's the translation point, which I've talked about before, which is mind. It is the mental space. And the mental space is where we define the idea of self. We define the idea of ego, I. That happens in the mind. That doesn't happen as the body. The body is a collective. The physical human form that we call human, Homo sapiens, the upright walking monkey thing, that is a collective. It's like a coral reef. You're made up of, I think it's trillions, but like just an absurd amount of cells. They're all doing stuff. And there's bacteria in the gut biome that's doing things. Cells and bacteria and all sorts of different things collectively living together to make up this human form. And it's all sealed up by, this tissue known as skin, which is really, this giant organ that creates a sheath around everything, creates a shell essentially, which is how Eckhart Tolle really writes about it. It's like this shell, or iamblichus, this vehicle, if you will. And it is a thing, but it's a collective. It's not one thing. You have, again, trillions, just an unfathomable amount of cells. Like, picture if you just filled your body up with grains of sand. How many that would be? So many. That's what you are. You're a collective in the physical form. And then in the ethereal form, we don't know because we haven't studied it enough. We don't know enough about it. And we have thought processes from antiquity that we've lost. I talk about the mystery schools a lot, and the reality there is we lost all of it. We hid it so much, we lost it. From the priesthoods to the mystery schools themselves to the, the old boys clubs and just the terrible idea that is humanity and how we hide things and want to be better than the person next to us. So we hold off information and we make them lesser to make us greater. We've lost the real information. We had it. We spent thousands of years trying to figure out all of these things. And then we hid it from ourselves. And we're stupid because we forgot where we put it. And now we lost it. And now we have to relearn it. That's part of the game now. We have to spend time relearning these things. So the mind is where we make up the idea of self. An ego, the I. That's where we define it. It happens in the mind space. And the mind space is the translation point between all the non-physical and the physical. It's so much so that through the idea of language and definition and those things, we create understanding. And we also do so when we have mental images and mental clarity and creativity and it all has to go through that mind space. It is the translation between these things. And that being said, that there is this translation point, there are a lot of great tools out there that we don't use. And this is really where I want to get into with this episode is when we talk about self-awareness, when we talk about self, we have to spend time figuring out what that is, learning about it, understanding it. Who are you? What are you? And I know, those are big topics and all stuff, but there's some little things in there, and there's some tools that we can use to get better understandings. And they're usually shunned, and they're usually, people are like, ooh, that's woo woo, or that's, weird, or again, I like to take the connotation off of things. So there are tools from antiquity, from the ancient times that we still have today that were used to better understand these things. One of those I'm going to start off with, the zodiac, right? There's two zodiacs. There's the Eastern zodiac and the Western zodiac. And I'm going to use the Eastern zodiac first, but we'll get into the Western zodiac as just a defining point here. In the Eastern zodiac, which isn't as old as everybody thinks it is, but it's pretty old, there's a better system. Because the Eastern zodiac, when you go to the Chinese restaurant, the old anecdotal idea, they have all the animals and the 12 animals on the zodiac, you were born this year, you're this animal. Well, that comes from a much older system. And it's specifically kind of Taoist by nature, but I haven't studied the whole history of it long enough. I haven't studied the whole history of it enough to know all the different entwining pieces. But it comes from essentially a much broader way of thinking about things, is the best way I can put that, or a Tao, if you will. The Tao Te Ching even gets into it just a tiny bit when it talks about another system of the universe that essentially that's kind of what it is. It's a way of understanding the universe. And the Eastern zodiac is a piece of this whole big, broad topic that comes from the I Ching uses it. And if you've never heard of the I Ching, the original I Ching comes from the reading of Styx and the hexagrams. Essentially, it creates these idea of hexagrams, and that gets into a whole nother practice. And then they have the coin I Ching. It's really interesting. Go look at it. I might get into it in detail. It's too big to get into in detail in just this episode. But the Eastern zodiac comes from that, because the Eastern zodiac is pieces of the understanding that is this whole collective. It's just one piece. Remember, I talked about yoga is just one piece of Ayurvedic medicine. It's just a physical, stretchy bit. I know I'm oversimplifying, but I have a tendency to do that. So the Eastern zodiac is one piece, and we only see one piece of the Eastern zodiac here on the Western side, because no one dives into it much deeper than that, because it's just this funny thing we see at Chinese restaurants, right? Well, that's not really true. The Eastern zodiac provides a wealth of information for someone to think about themselves, not define themselves by, but to think about themselves using. So in the Eastern zodiac, you have an animal by year. Now, also by your birth year, and now remember, they work on the lunar cycle, so it happens somewhere around February when the Lunar New Year happens. That starts the new zodiac sign. So that's what that's what most people get wrong. It's not the Western New Year of December 31st, January 1st. It's the Chinese or the Lunar New Year, which is usually somewhere in February. Towards the end of February is usually when the lunar calendar changes over. So there's that. Now that gives you your animal sign, and animal signs have characteristics or traits. And then you have your hexagram, which is by year in that sense. So you could be the mountain hexagram, which is typically, that's if you were the youngest child. You would then have the mountain, I believe it's the youngest child has the mountain, or fourth child. Again, super complex here. But that gives you your hexagram, and that has traits to it. But going back to the Eastern zodiac, your birth year also is an element. So there's the 5 element system that gets involved now too. So you could be a dragon, you could be a rat, you could be a snake, you could be a ox, a rooster, you could be any one of those, any one of the 12. But every 12 years, coming back to that, we get a new element, and there's 5 elements. So even if you meet someone who's older than you, who's also the same sign as you, 12 years, and go 12 years forward or 12 years back, that person would share your sign. They don't share your element. You'd have a different element. So there's a whole nother layer of complexity there we never even think about, never even talk about. You can have a metal ox and a wood ox. You can have a water ox. You can have a metal snake. You can have a water snake. You can have all these. You can have a fire dragon or a wood dragon. there's all these different layers of complexity in here. All we see, unfortunately, in the Western system, and even just, if you go to like modern China, some people, the younger crowd, don't really get into it much. But there's another layer of complexity to that whole idea of the zodiac. And it goes beyond just the animals. The animals are just a representation of traits, not really star signs, because they don't line up that way, but just a representation of traits of people born in certain years. And then you add an element to that. And then you add a hexagram by, were they the first child, the second child, the third child? Were they this or that? There's another layer that gets added into there when you add in the hexagrams, and then you add in, so you have the 5 element system, the zodiac system, the hexagram system, Bagua. That's what I'm thinking. I'm sorry. I've been trying to think of this word the entire time. The Bagua, and that's the hexagram system. There's a whole martial arts system based on that known as Bagua. Bagua Zhen, I believe, is the full name for it. Don't quote me on that one. That one's probably wrong. But as a side note, martial arts system, very, very interesting, technically detailed, very specific system that really I've seen some people grow from. Fascinating. If you're into martial arts, please go look at Bagua. It's a fascinating system. So then you add in the Taoist practices and all these other things. It just comes up with these just multitude of layers. Now let's jump over to the Western zodiac, because we know about those. We have Aries, Pisces, Aquarius, all those things. That system also has a multitude of depth to it we never get into. Most people just be like, "Oh, I'm an Aries." Okay, well that's great. I'm a Pisces. Okay, well, that is just the face value system that we see a lot. There's more to it. There's more depth that we never get into. You can be, that's a sun sign. Let me describe it that way. And these are things I want to get into more in later episodes. I'm just kind of giving a face value effort here. The Western zodiac system, to the Aries, Pisces, Aquarius, Scorpio, that system, that's a sun sign. It's one sign of it's. So where these things come across is specifically designed in when the zodiac system was created. Where the zodiac system comes from was the sun travels through the signs of the zodiac. And again, the representation of the zodiac symbol doesn't necessarily correspond to what the constellation looks like. But it's, if you took the night sky and you divided it up into 12 pieces, originally it was 10 actually, and then they split one in half and created the 12 system. It was 11 and then they split one in half and created 12. That system of where the sun travels for, that's self. It's not sidereal. So I've talked about this before, how we have Earth, and then we have everything that's sidereal, everything that's outside of Earth. And it is two different factors. There are two different Western zodiac systems. There is the ego or self side, which is the position of the sun in correlation to the Earth that's coming from us, from self. If I look out into the night sky and I see the sun, look out into the world above the Earth and see the sun, where is the sun in relation to the constellations? Then there's also the sidereal, which I don't specifically remember the name of, but it's also more Ayurvedic. The Hindus used it. That has to correspond of where the Earth is in its constellational representation so there's multiple. You can have these different pieces, but let's just go back to the original one I was talking about, what we consider usually the Western zodiac set. Well, in the Western zodiac set, you have your sun sign, and the sun sign again is in correlation to where is the sun during your birth in representation on angle to the Earth. If we draw a straight line, where does that line point into? What constellation body is it in? if we separate the night sky into 12 constellations. Then you have a moon sign. Where was the moon in definition 2? If I draw a line from the Earth to the moon, what constellation was it in? And then I have all of the actual sidereal bodies themselves in correlation to where the Earth was. If I draw lines to all the other planets, where are they in the constellational sets? Because the constellational sets are the sidereal. That's what I was talking about when I was talking about the other, the sidereal constellation system, and where the whole system is moving through as an actual like solar system moving in its constellational things. This is where we come up with all those different, if you've heard the different quotes of different years, system times and things like that, it's 2160 set, the 6000, the I don't remember all of them. I apologize. I think there's a 24,000, there's 128,000, there's a whole bunch. These breakdowns, but specifically the 6,000 is what we use, and that's not, don't quote that number. It's close enough. The 6,000 year process is going through all the different constellations because it takes 72,000 years to make one full revolution of the solar system through all of the constellational bodies. So you have all of these different pieces. And in real astrology, which is the old ancient study of all of this, those can all be used to give the person, the self, the ego, maybe a better understanding, or at least a way of thinking about things that might resonate a little bit better than just kind of being like, you're this or you're that. So when you look at your zodiac sign, it'll have traits. It'll have positive traits and negative traits. Most people only look at the positive traits, but it's a good thing to do to look at the negative traits. And then you can look at your moon rising sign. You can look at where Jupiter was. You can look at where Saturn was. You can look at where Mars was, and you can find out all these different pieces that might resonate with you. And that was the old study of self. And a lot of it was done more so on the negative side. You would teach someone their zodiac and constellational and their astrological information to predict what their downfalls could be. Remember, I talk about divination, and when we talk about divination, or to divine, to have forward thought, to be able to predict the future, we often do so in measurements of the past. Okay, all divinity is predictions of the future from the past. That's what divinity is. That's the idea of divining. Nostradamus and all these things. The translation points there are terrible. Just look at the United States Constitution. Making sense of that in the language they used not very long ago, to be honest, and if you look at historically, we can't even figure out what they were trying to say. So if we look at that idea, astrology, which uses geometry and a bunch of other mathematical equations to figure out these things, and again, there's both sidereal and non-sidereal. In typical Western society, we use from the Earth perspective of I, perspective of self. That's the whole point. To give an understanding to the individual so that they can have a better understanding of themselves. It was the whole point of astrology. It was not to predict when you were going to find love or when you were going to have a bad day. That really wasn't the idea. The idea was to give a possible understanding of self, or at least a place to start, because that's the conversation I have the most. Actually, recently I had a very interesting conversation, or a comment, at least, from an individual where she said, I talked about how I talk about self-awareness and I talk about mental health, and sometimes I teach self-awareness. And she caught me and she called me out on the idea that, like, can you teach self-awareness? And I was like, wait a minute, I can't. I don't teach self-awareness. I teach the tools that can lead to self-awareness. I teach information that might lead to self-awareness. An encyclopedia, for you, a place to look for the information that might lead to self-awareness. Might not. One of those I use personally, and I've seen a lot of people use, but not a good understanding thereof, is astrology. because that's what astrology was there to do. It was there to give a good understanding or a possible understanding of who you were. Every culture has had some sort of thing that involved this, some way of divining what a person might be like. And yeah, there's always that conversation of, if you start off telling a child these things, maybe that's what they do grow into. But I find when people read their, sun sign and they go, oh, I'm kind of like that, but I'm not kind of like that. But when you start adding in the other pieces, their moon sign, where was Mars, and was this retrograde or that, and you give them an actual full picture, the full scope of real astrology, they go, huh, okay, that's a little accurate. It's kind of close. But it also triggers something where they start to think like, oh, you know what, I'm a little stubborn, or, I do have a pitfall of constantly needing like physical stuff and things like that. That happens. And it starts to develop this conversation in their own minds, their own mind space, where self-awareness begins to take root. The study of self, the study of ego. And it's not egotistical because it's in the mind space. It is the ego. It is the ego. It is there. It is that space. So I think there are these tools that often get thrown to the side because there's not a greater understanding of it. And the conversation is typically the connotation of, remember, I hate connotations sometimes, most of the time. Oh, that's quackery. That's all BS. That's all metaphysics bullshit. That's all. No, astrology was, I'm going to hazard to say it, a full science. Defined. How whole system involved. We just don't ever see the whole of it. We only see one piece of it. And that goes back to the birthday guru douchebag thing of, there was a bunch of people that just coerced it and just downgraded it into what we see of the Chinese fucking placemat, the 12 animals, and a little snippet of, you might be like this, or the Western zodiac sign of, you're just an Aquarius, or, no, there's so much more to these things. And they're tools. They're not absolutes. In no way should you ever treat these as absolutes. You should never use them to make decisions whimsically. They're tools to better understand the situation, to better understand yourself. That is what they were used for. That's how they were defined. That was the whole reason they were created, was to have a tool of understanding. And Christianity threw all that out the window when it fought against the pagans, because these come from pagan understanding and pagan cultures and polytheistic cultures and other different cultures other than the Christian cultures. They threw it all out. They stole what they wanted. And they said, no. You are of God's will and you must exalt this God. And, depending on the Abrahamic religion you believe in, I shouldn't just call it Christianity, but it's only this one way. When in reality, they got all of that from those different teachings of divining in this form or that form. In the North Germanic, what we consider Viking, and I've had my conversation about how Viking's a verb, and there are the Viking people, but they're North Germanic by nature, and all the other different Sweden, all the other different cultures that were involved in that at the time. It was a much bigger space before it got broken up and unified. But those pagan individuals there was always a person in those cultures who was the spiritual leader. And that person typically casted runes. That was their way of divining. They would cast runes, or they would read, I forget what the name of it is, but there is a divination method of reading the entrails of an animal after a kill, or casting the bones, which was usually the vertebral bones of either a human or another animal, and you would use different ones to do different things, to do these things known as divining. But it was just a tool. It was never taken specifically literally. There was always the decision of the self, the ego. It was in the mind space. It was just a way of understanding things. You would go to the spiritual leader of the pagan community to get a better understanding of what was going on. And that individual really was even almost more important than the chieftains and the leaders. And that's where Christianity realized, oh, There's these spiritual leaders. And if we become the main body of the spiritual leaders, everyone will have to follow us. The Vatican requires the masses to believe that they have some higher understanding and that you should believe in it. And that's why the Pope should lead you and the Catholic Church should be right. That requires the people to give away their ego, to give away their I to the collective. And I've spoken about that before, and it's not the right answer. But they stole that from the idea that there was these pagan spiritual leaders that everyone in the community would go to, including the chieftain all the way down to the farmer, to get a better understanding of self, a better understanding of what life's purpose was and what. And I'm not saying that religion's bad. Organized religion is bad. When the individual gives themselves to the collective, but doesn't retain themselves, retain their ego. That's bad. That's dangerous. And there was multiple different things. There's extrasensory and intuition, and there's tarot. I keep a tarot deck. Tarot, by definition, was a way of understanding a situation, to give a perspective thereof. That's why there's the major arcana. Tarot, by nature, the cards, the history is a little bit debated. If you want a pretty good understanding, you can look at the Rider-Waite understanding. Waite was a philosophical writer who wrote, actually Waite did a whole thing on Paracelsus, which was fantastic, but Waite gives a good understanding of where he believes the tarot, the cards used, come from. And that's up for debate. There's a couple different understandings of where they come from, but there is a good understanding that in the French community, the 52 subcards, the 4 suits, which we now call ace, spades, hearts, and clubs, are really the suits of coins, swords, wands, and I always forget the third one, damn it. But those make up the subset. That's 1 through, ace through, ace is included. So 1 through 10. And then we have, 1 through 9, 1 through 10. And then we have Jack, Queen, King are in there too, but they have a better representation. But it gives us the 52 card deck. On top of that, inside of tarot, we have the arcana. So you have the minor arcana, and then you have the major arcana. The minor arcana are the Jack, Queen, King, Ace. And then you have the suits, which are just the 1 through 10. And then we have the major arcana. And the major arcana is really what's debatable as the most important part of tarot, because it gives definition. When a major arcana piece comes up, it's something to pay attention to. Not that the other ones aren't just as important, but it gives that defining piece. And it is a way of divining. So is radiesthesia. So is, pendulum dowsing. You can, use those things or what's known as dowsing. One of the original forms of that is what's known as water divining, which, someone gets 2 copper rods or 2 sticks of a specific shape to go look for underground water sources. These were all just tools. No one has ever said that they're 100%. And anyone who does say that they're 100% accurate is lying. They don't understand that these are just ways to have a better understanding of the translation in the mental space. And they explain what's known as intuition. Because if you've ever had a real reading from a general intuitive, which in some cases I can be, and I've experienced being a general intuitive. It's not something I practice all that much or am that great at, to be honest. But when you really have an experience with a general intuitive, someone who's just in tune, has intuition, it's an interesting perspective that you may not have had to begin with. And even that individual will say, it's just their way, they're reading it the way they see it. But it's to get you to think. And I'm all about that. I'm all about getting people to think. So it's just another understanding, an outside perspective to provide. It's a tool to be used to make decisions, to make choices. Remember, choice begets change. And a choice is just a choice until it becomes finalized as a decision. And then those decisions, when correlated, beget the change we want. So they're just tools. They're tools to understand the self, tools to understand the ego. They're ancient ways of understanding. And we've lost that to a degree. But if you look at the zodiac, and we talk about the 6,000-year cycles that make up the full 72,000-year cycle, or whatever you want to call it, 2160 for each. There's a bunch of different ways to map it out. But inside of that, there's this idea that when we work through these constellation pieces, sidereal, not Earth, but the whole system, the sun itself, remember, the sun drags us behind in a heliocentric orbit, which means if you have the sun, make a spiral behind that, that's the orbit of all the different planets. Each planet has a spiral behind the sun. And it's not all that elongated. Like, it's not that very, it's kind of far away, but not too far away. But the planets make spiral patterns behind the sun. And the sun is hurtling through space. Fucking flying. We are just space trash being dragged behind a giant comet, essentially. A giant flaming ball hurtling through this, space at a ridiculous speed. I don't know the actual speed of it, but just so I think I wish I had the exact numbers to give you an idea. And I might have given this example before, but I'll give it again. The Earth spins on an axis. Okay, that gives us our 24-hour day cycle. That axis spin is so fast that if the Earth were to just stop spinning, you would travel the distance between the East Coast of the United States of America and the West Coast of the United States of America, roughly 3,200 or 3,300 miles, in the matter of 3 seconds. I think we're spinning at somewhere 1,062 miles a second or whatever. But also at the same time, we're spinning so fast that if we were to stop spinning abruptly, the crust of the Earth would shear itself off so violently that large swaths of land would shoot off into space so fast that it would take the atmosphere with it. You wouldn't really know anything happened other than the big bang and the horizon changing colors, but it would take the atmosphere with it that you actually wouldn't suffocate till 30 some seconds afterwards. That this whole chunk of land would just go flying off into space with you on it, and then eventually you would suffocate, but it happened so fast that you would just fly away. That's crazy speeds. Multiply that just by 10 and it would be crazy. That's how fast the sun is just cruising through space. I don't even think 10 is enough. I think it's 100 or something. It's ridiculous. So the sun is hurtling through space. You're space trash behind it on a little space. You're the eraser mark on the crumbled up piece of paper that is the Earth in this analogy. And we're moving through space. And that's our little solar system. And we're in a galaxy. And that galaxy is doing its thing. But the solar system is moving. Our sun is moving through these zodiac signs in its own little spiral pattern, getting pulled behind whatever mass might be pulling us that we haven't figured out yet, known as the Milky Way galaxy. So in that sign setup, the sun, again, moving, and it being, this is the sidereal method, it's moving through its zodiac signs. So it itself has its own little sign things. And as of the recording of this episode, if we look at the charts of antiquity, they say the sun is moving out of the age of Pisces and moving into the age of Aquarius. That's at this very time of this recording. That's specifically if we believe the whole mapped out charts, which is probably pretty close, we're coming out of the age of Pisces, and we've probably actually, as of recording of this, we've probably already started to move into the age of Aquarius. We've probably left the age of Pisces behind it and actually crossed over and moving into the age of Aquarius. What does that mean for collectiveness? Well, the age of Pisces, the stereotypical idea given, and the traits and ideas, the characteristics are of the school of fish. That's what Pisces represents. Its characteristics of the grand scheme is the school of fish who are the collective. And that's what we did for and the numbers given is 2,160, somewhere around there. Don't quote the years. It doesn't really matter. They're so big of numbers that give or take 20 or 30 years, it doesn't really matter. Give or take a lifetime, doesn't really matter. So that was the age of creating societies, building organizations, putting together civilization. Because there needed to be a collective idea. There needed to be fishies being led by the master fish. Which, if you look at the whole idea of prophets in the Abrahamic religions, they are the leader of fishes, the shepherd of men, the fisher of men. Those are the analogies given. This is why. There's actually a pagan god whose name I always forget, but is the representation of the leader of the school of fish. And it's not Poseidon, but Poseidon was actually the god of antiquity known for his dealings with the Atlanteans, and that's another thing we can get into another time. I know everybody thinks I'm weird, but just go with it. So that specific idea is the school of fish and the following of the collective, giving the self over to the school of fish, because if you don't, you might die. You might get picked off by the whale. You might get picked off by the shark. You might get picked off by the swordfish or the other, fishy trying to eat you, those types of things. So you had to be a part of the school of fish for protection. We're moving out of that age into the age of Aquarius. And the age of Aquarius is represented by the characteristic of self, of knowledge, of individual thought, of the individual, actually. And this is where a lot of people are talking about people waking up, people, becoming conscious, becoming aware. But it's a dangerous time because you're getting a lot of these breathy guru douchebags coming back into the light, back into the fruition of, I can get the people. I can. They're trying to hold on to the old way. They're trying to hold on to please give me yourself. Follow my system. Follow my practices. Follow me. Nope. It's not time for that anymore. That's the old age of Pisces. They're holding on to that. And it's a really dangerous time because that's what the governments are doing. That's what, the politicians and the political powers and the social structures, that's what they want. This is the time for that. This is the time for the fight between those those subjects. It's right at the changeover. And it's always been a warning. All of antiquity, all of the ancient texts, they warn about this time. It's happened time and time again that a writing about the changeover of ages warns about the change and what might happen. And the warning behind the change between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius, which is what I believe and a lot of others believe we're going through right now, is the time of self and ego. And to be aware of who you are, what you are, why you are. Remember, I don't like why questions, but it's a good subjective question, so ask it to yourself. Because it is subject. It's not objective, it's subjective. So that conversation is the dangerous thing to the school of fish, to the Pisces. They don't want that. Those holding on to the old ways, they don't want that to happen. They don't want you to have that conversation. They don't want to have the tools that might lead to a better understanding. They don't want you to look at the zodiac signs and its astrology of the real in-depth, be it Western or Eastern, the Eastern with its astrology and Western with its, the reals, the 5-element system, the hexagrams, the Bagua, the Bajing, all of these things. They don't want you to look at that. They don't want you to look at runes. They don't want you to look at tarot. They don't want you to look at other spiritual leaders. The world religions, the deep-rooted Abrahamic religions, have a very tough time with this time. It's not their time. It's dangerous to them. And they may go to extremes to hold on to you, but you can't allow that to happen. And I'm not saying it's not okay to be religious. Absolutely. Have faith. Don't have blind faith, but have faith. That's fine. If that's who you are, if that is what represents you, that's fine. But beware of organized religions, because they want the self. They want the ego. That's the whole idea of tithing in the Catholic Church. The whole idea of tithing is to support the system and to feel good about doing it, to give away your wages, to give away your earnings to the system, to build the tithe, to build the pool. That's to give it away. It's give away self, give away ego. Give it up. Don't be selfish. Don't be egotistical. But you have to remember, that's a scale. It is possible to be egotistical and it is possible to be selfish, but it's not to say that you shouldn't be that sometimes. You just shouldn't be that all the time. Remember, the world is seeking balance. The universe is seeking balance at all times without reservation. It's always seeking balance, but it does it asymmetrically. The idea of duality is actually triality. Hell, the Christian religion teaches that. The three. God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus Christ. That's what they teach. They teach the three. Triality. They put it right in your face. And I'm not saying don't be Christian. Don't be Muslim. Don't be Judaic. Don't be, Jainistic. I'm not saying don't be any of these things. If it's what you believe, it's what you believe. But I want you to ask yourself, is that you, the self, your ego, is that what it believes? Or is it what the group believes? Because this is the dangerous changeover point. It's dangerous for everybody because you can lose yourself real easy. And as much as we need self-awareness at this time, we need self-understanding, we need to understand mental health, it's a dangerous time to do so because there's just so much in the churn, in the froth, there's so many things in the system just churning up, that it can be a dangerous time. You can get lost again. That's what all these texts warned about over time. That's what the tarot warns about. It's what the zodiac warns about. It's what the rune casting warns. They all warn about these things, which is why they're tools to be used to get a better understanding, but not to be followed, because their message is don't believe 100% in this. That's not the answer. That's what's known as blind faith, and blind faith is dangerous. You may have faith, but not have blind faith, because all those, people say, take the leap of faith. You don't take a leap of faith without some direction. No one walks up to the cliff and goes, if I just jump off this cliff, there's going to be buried treasure below it, and I'm going to land in a pool of water. That's blind faith, and it leads to death more times than not. A leap of faith is really defined by the idea of, I have a very good intuitional feeling, and I've done some research, and I really think if I go this direction, I'll find what I'm looking for. And then you go and try. That's a real true leap of faith. It's not a blind leap. It's a leap of faith. The faith is you've done the research, you've had the thought process, you've spent the time thinking about, you've correlated all these things together that you believe this is the right way to go. You've looked at the tarot, you look at the runes. That's the idea. Those are the things you would do before taking the leap of faith. When the Vikings went and looked for new lands to Vike, and they learned about the sunstone so that they could correlate, even if it was overcast, the cloudy skies, they'd use the sunstone to focus the sun's rays so that they'd be able to use the sextant and, be able to figure out where their direction they were actually traveling. They had a good idea of what they were looking for. And the sunstone gave them the ability to go on the right path. Before, they would just sail wildly and not know what direction. If they couldn't see the sun, they didn't know. Or if they couldn't see the stars, they couldn't navigate. The sunstone gave them the ability to do that even during overcast and stormy skies. But before that, they'd be like, the currents all go this way. And, they would stay on the coastline. And then they would see oh, all right, well, the current changes here. And then they could travel out a little bit and be like, oh, there's an island. Oh, there's a landmass. And then, they had maps and they would be like, oh, well, these people came from there. And they didn't just go sail in a direction. Those people usually died. And most of the people in the village were like, well, told you so. Obviously you shouldn't have done that. But then they found mapping tools and other ways of sailing. And that has happened throughout history. And that's the idea of taking a leap of faith compared to taking a blind leap. And I don't suggest taking blind leaps. I do suggest on occasion, when you've done all the things and you really feel like it, go ahead and take the leap of faith, but don't take my word for it. Figure it out for yourself. That's the whole point. That's the point of self. That's the point of ego. That's the point of magic. By definition, magic happens when we forget it doesn't. Magic works, magic exists when we forget it doesn't. The old practices of magic are typically represented in today's day and age by things like Agrippa and all of these other writers who talk about ceremonial magic, and ceremonial magic is typically black magic by definition, and black magic was talked against in most cases. But true, normal, everyday magic that the whole world grew up with, your ancestors grew up with, was basic practices of understanding the world and the situations we lived in, and then to give us some hope or give us some direction to work on. We use magical practices all the time. We just don't call them magical practices anymore because we've come up with better understandings of them. So it's not really magical anymore because we don't need to have a leap of faith in it. We didn't know these things worked in the past. In the world of antiquity, we didn't know, we didn't know these things specifically worked more times than not. So it was a leap of faith. We just had an understanding that, okay, this works usually, so I'm going to try it. It gives me direction. Now we use these things all the time. Journaling is a magical practice. There's all sorts of them. Cursing, hexing, these types of things. To curse someone as a magical practice was to openly, verbally express a curse upon them, so that you were hoping that their mental state or others' subconscious or consciousness would attach to that idea. So if you were to curse someone in public in the town forum, if someone were to cast a curse on someone, it would make the rest of the people think like, oh, did they do something bad? Should I watch out for that person? Should I disassociate myself with that person? And then that person would suffer there from that. The differentiation between a curse and a hex is a curse you would do public with knowledge. A hex you would do privately, and you would almost meditate on the idea of hexing someone. So there's that. There was witches' brews and witches' potions, and those are different things. Potions were draughts that you would actually ingest, whereas a witch's brew is something that you would do specifically defined to cause an outcome. We do these things constantly. Nowadays we call it superstition. That's, sometimes we even call it OCD. A lot of people call these magical processes that we used to go about, we call them OCD. I got to do this, that, and that thing, and the outcome will be the same every time. Repetition over and over again. That has root in magical ideas. No, I'm not saying OCD is a magical malmutation. No. But we've come up with better understanding that the magical practices of antiquity are now kind of more normal. They're just normalized. But we don't see that in all aspects because we don't study how they came into, fact by magical. Prayer by definition, specifically prayer in a group setting, is magical practice by definition from pagan antiquity. The priesthood would come together to pray on or lay hands. That's another magical practice, to lay hands. We usually hear the word magic, and because of connotation, because of it's been coerced into the idea that it's this weird, creepy thing, witches and wizards, and it's not great, it's shady, and that's just not true. That's just not true. The witch of the society in antiquity was typically the holistic healer. You went to the witch because she had an understanding of herbs and spices and different things and maladies, and they would do their best to help you. It wasn't some just crazy, ugly lady in the woods with warts and trying to eat children. No, the witch was the spiritual leader / herbal practitioner of the group that tried to help the populace in which she lived in. Because if she didn't, she'd be shunned and then sent off into the woods, and she would die because she wouldn't have a way of sustaining herself unless she, knew how to do everything on her own, which is possible, but probably not likely, given how somehow we forgot we used to live in some shit, man. We survived in hard conditions comparative to today. Technology and the world we live in now, yes, it's shitty sometimes. I get it. But we forget we didn't used to have cell phones. We didn't used to have the internet. We didn't used to have building technology to create houses cheaply, readily, overnight. We lived in huts made out of mud and sticks and animal pelts. We didn't usually have clothing. Textiles weren't a thing for a long time. We had just crappy clothing. So winter weather could kill you. There would be times you just couldn't leave your house, because if you left the warmth of the fire for more than 15, 20 minutes, you'd freeze to death because you didn't have the type of clothing to go out in that weather. We didn't have cars. We had horses, which we had to keep alive, and that was time and effort to get anywhere, where you had to walk. And again, if it was cold, you might freeze to death. We had to hunt. No one, farms existed, but they weren't the sharecrop of everything for a while. When farming first started, it took a while for there to be a surplus. And then you had to store these things. We didn't have refrigeration. We forget that we were able to survive during that. And during that survival, we used tools like the zodiac, like tarot, like runes, other divination methods like radiesthesia and dowsing, and just having a general intuitive in the society, having a general health practitioner who had an understanding of herbology and herbs and how it corresponded with nutrition and different signs of ailment. Medical practitioners who really weren't doctors, just that's what their life work was to understand these things, to all the way down to just the farmer who had an idea of an understanding of astrology and knew when the equinoxes were, because they knew, if I plant now, I'll be able to harvest this time. And if I don't get the seeds in the ground by this time, they'll die and they won't grow. Ancient farmers had to have a full knowledge of astrology in order to give themselves the cycles of the solstices in which to grow certain products, so that society could create itself, could become a thing. That was all a tool of astrology, a tool of the cycles of, it's the idea of these cycles. And that all came down to self, and that all came down to ego. And there's a great understanding of antiquity of the individual. And yes, we had to give that up for a while to the collective so that we could build these amazing things that we've built. But we've gone too far. And it's time to take back the self, take back the ego, get a better understanding of yourself, how your mind works, where your mind space is, where that translation point is, how it works. And one way we can do that is by the study of self and the study of, mental health or ego, of that incorporated piece of the differentiation between the collective of the body, all these cells and bacteria and organisms that make up the physical form, and the things we don't understand, the ethereal, divination, divine, magical, all the other things. So we don't quite know, all the metaphysics and all that. But that happens in the mind, happens in the ego. So it's okay to be egotistical sometimes. It's okay to be selfish sometimes. We just need to keep it in check. Like all things need to find balance. The universe is constantly, without reservation, trying to find balance. It does it asymmetrically. So I don't think it's wrong for people to use tools like I've listed, or have an understanding of, trying to get back to their roots of what is the culture they come from, what is their heritage, and these types of things. I think those are tools to be used. But we have to, again, create balance. We have to understand, okay, if I'm going to study myself and I'm going to use the zodiac, I have to take the time and make the effort to understand what that means. Well, it's not just this, like, it's not just the little Chinese placemat with the 12 animals and a little snippet. No, it's much more than that. Your birth year comes with an animal sign, and it comes with an element of the 5-element system that has its own traits, both positive and negative, which is actually why I like to eliminate connotation on things, because all of these systems in antiquity come with both sides. There's never a singly positive or a singly negative side. They always try to balance themselves out because it warns against, hey, you might be prone to being an asshole. Don't do that. Don't allow that to happen. Keep that in check. It warns against these things. Or if it's the Eastern sign with astrology and, the sun sign, the moon sign, where was your Mars rising? Where was your Venus at? Where was, or go back to the Druidic faiths of, what was your ruling tree? Fascinating thing a lot of people don't know about is in the Druidic faith, specifically in Scotland and Ireland, they have what's known as the ruling tree, or what tree you came from. Your birth year has to do with what tree you were ruled by. And there's a lot. There's the alder tree and the oak and the spruce, and the tree would give, and that's part of the Druidic faiths, was your tree provided your root of your system, of your family, because they believed that the forest, all of the trees of the forest communicated with each other, and that the different individual trees themselves, the genetics of the tree, spruce, alder, oak, pine, maple, those root systems are of one. They're all one. I call it Genesis because they all come from one seed, one idea. So all alder trees, all spruce trees, all pine trees, all maple trees are all from the one Genesis, the one gene, and that creates your family of system in the Druidic faith. And that it was very common in the Druidic faiths that to be a true Druid, you were not of the collective. You weren't of a family unit. You were a Druid of Druidic nature. And that was a specific idea in the Druidic faith, that there was typically only one true Druid in the ancient mystery schools per group of people. So if you were to be initiated into the Druidic faiths, you didn't typically stay with your family and that group. You would get supplanted into another one, or you would break off and create a new group, because that was the way of survival. And there were, as things grew bigger, the Druidic orders started to get a little bit multifaceted, and I don't have the necessary full history to give you on all of that, but there was a specific idea of the ego in the Druidic faith, and again, that had to do with their birth trees and how that specified itself. So they would be able to supplant an individual Druid into the collectives to help lead them as their spiritual advisor, spiritual leader, but to do so that individual fit that collective, and then would be able to report back to the Druid order itself. And that order was multifaceted and typically represented by threes. So you would have three of each. Again, it gets super complicated, but there's always prime numbers involved. So yes, there are all of these tools, and there's the three health bodies, and dualism is actually triality, and it all comes back to self and ego. And it's time that we don't need to destroy civilization. We don't need to destroy the collective. That's not the answer. We do need to act individually, though. And we need to better understand self and ego. And that, yes, we should not allow ourselves to be egotistical and selfish all the time. But it's okay to be egotistical and selfish some of the time. It's totally okay to want to shut out the world for a little while and just go, be like, I'm going to put on my comfy clothes, and I'm going to make or order my favorite meal, and I'm going to watch my favorite movie or listen to my favorite music. And, I'm just going to chill and do me. That's totally okay. doing that all the time, it depends, you know. I'll give my own little personal example as a wrap up here. I spent a really long time being what most people would consider selfless and humble and all that time. And it's not to say that I do really bad with people complimenting me or associating me with certain traits. I never saw it that way. I spent time from the point in which I was what would be considered homeless. I don't consider it homeless because I was living out of my car. I had somewhere to sleep, unlike some others. But I spent between that point in time until very recently, where I bought my own home, working. I went to work. Sometimes 70 hours a week, sometimes 80 hours a week. I just went to work. I worked and I made money. I paid my bills. I saved what I could. I paid off debt. I worked. I was just a workaholic. I still am kind of a workaholic. I just worked. And in doing so, I gave up nearly everything that made me me. I gave up my interests. All the way down to the point where I stopped going to a martial arts class. Even though I had already changed over to specifically being a martialist, I gave up one of my great enjoyments, which was to go to a martial arts class. One, because sometimes it cost too much money and I couldn't afford it. And two, it cost too much time and I didn't have the time to put into the class because I could do these practices on my own. That was the definition of becoming a martialist compared to a martial artist. I could just practice my own ways and methods of things. I had to give that up. I gave up my likes of things I like to go out and do. I gave up social interaction in some cases, not just because, I'm not very social to begin with, but because social interactions typically cost money. And I couldn't afford that. I needed to work and to pay and to build a stability so that I could find a home. And then when I had a place to rent, so that I could find maybe a better, more secure place, because I lived in some shoddy locations and with some shoddy situations, and to build some stability there, and then to have stability of financial nature, because part of that's a huge part of mental health, and I'll have to get into at some point, to have financial stability so that you can not have to worry about eating, not have to worry about being able to afford groceries, which is why I worked in a restaurant a lot, because you can get free meals in restaurants and not have to worry about buying groceries. But I spent a lot of time doing that. And thus I gave up a lot of myself and a lot of my ego, and people consider that to be selfish, and they consider that to be humble when, somebody be like, hey, can you cover my shift? And I'd be like, yeah. When in reality, some of that was actually selfish. But in the same vein of that, I spent a lot of time giving up all of the things that I liked. And I lost myself to this idea of just being the person who's responsible and works. And I'm not saying that's a bad person to be, but at some point I had to sit down and have a discussion with myself of, dude, you gave up everything and anything that you enjoyed, that was what you liked, that is what you were, of who you were. What do you have left? And I had to realize, oh shit, I have to work on my ego, myself. I have to learn to be selfish. I have to learn to have an ego moment, to be like, hey, I'm doing this. And the weird part about it is, in some cases, it's the same. So some people give me shit that, oh, you were just being selfish the whole time, or, you haven't changed in any way. Because of the fact that I like my own personal me time alone. Because I'm not a very social person in that regard. Because I spent a lot of time having to be social. If you work a 16-hour day, you're around people constantly. And when part of that day is being a bouncer at night in very vibrant social bars that had a bunch of people and loud music and all that crap, it exhausts you as someone who likes to spend their own time alone. So whereas I used to not be involved in social friend interaction zones because I was working too much and didn't have the time to do that, now to be selfish, I often don't go to social events. And there is no differentiation there to the outside view. And I get it. So if someone gets mad at me for not wanting to be involved and not wanting to go out, I get it. But it is me being selfish. It is me having that ego moment, having that selfish moment of being like, dude, I just need to sit in the home that I spent years busting my ass to afford and watch one of my favorite movies or genres of something, or, to watch this or watch that and just to eat a meal I got to cook in my house. Like, that's me time. But that doesn't look any different than, hey man, I can't come because I got to work. Now it's just, I can't come because I don't want to, but it's still, I can't come. I don't want to go. Like, I'm not going to go. So there is a factor to that you have to become comfortable with when you're going to do this in-depth look at yourself. That this idea of selfishness and egotisticalness are an outside perspective in most cases that you can't give too much weight to. Because really going in depth to who you are is a personal matter. It's a personal time thing. It doesn't involve others most cases. So there is going to be pushback, or there is going to be these outside perspectives. And that is the differentiation of the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, and what all of antiquity is warned about in old literature and predictions, and where the tools of the zodiac and tarot and runes and divination and astrology and horoscopes and those types of things come into, because it helps give a little bit of a direction so that the blind leaps of faith aren't blind, are just leaps of faith. Because a blind leap is a bad idea. A leap of faith, though, can lead, can be correct, can be in the right direction. But these tools can be used to help get through that tough, non-understanding, very tough, just generally bleh period of the initial steps to working on consciousness, working on self-awareness, working on waking up, working on being aware. It can help with those things. So I think that's the idea of self. That's the idea of ego. It must not be eliminated. Alan Watts, the most egotistical thing you can do is try to eliminate your ego. Don't do that. Try to understand it. Really try to focus on it and get a better understanding. And feel free to use tools to do that. Just know that those tools aren't 100% accurate. They're just to give direction. They're just to give a different perspective or way of thinking of it. We pay counselors and psychologists to do that. We go out with friends to get those perspectives. We have close circles of people we trust for that fact. But not everyone has that. So there are all these tools out there, and not everyone has the ability to have maybe these, very serious conversations with some other people. There's not many people I would trust to have conversations. Yeah, there's not a very big list of people I would trust to have the conversations on the deep-rooted psychological pieces of myself. In fact, there are some cases of my psyche, of my ego, of myself that I would never discuss with someone else because it is so personal to me, but I need to understand it and I need to have an awareness of it. So I use these tools to better grasp that idea. And then also in the same light, there are some things that people would rather discuss with people they know not at all, such as a psychologist or a counselor, and that you can get some modicum of trust because you understand that they will not discuss this or have no link to your real social life that they would not discuss with anyone that would matter or know. you can find that maybe in the general intuitive or the intuitive healer or the holistic healer or those types of things. So these are all tools from antiquity and ideas from the past that I think we should become more aware of now. And we've taught about this forever, that there is the self, there is the ego. And I'm saying it's time to study it and time to focus on it and find ways to understand it, because it's possible. You can do that. And it gives a clarity of sorts that is nearly unattainable in anything else we do. Imagine having an understanding of the translation dictionary between two languages. Imagine having that understanding. Not being able to translate, not knowing one language and knowing another language, knowing the translation piece, like having an understanding of that, having an understanding of translation, of understanding. That is the art of self, of ego. To understand one's own ego, one's own I, allows one to be egotistical. I argue that those individuals who are constantly like, I do this and I do that, they come across as egotistical, know very little about themselves. Thus, they are not ego. They are attempting to be separate. That is a cry of, I don't know who I am. I think I do, but I don't. It's very easy to spot those people. And in fact, this may sound negative to some, but I'll leave you with this in the end, because I think it gives a correlation to self and ego and thought and the translation of the mind between the physical and the other. I never trust anyone who is constantly seeking my praise or my pity. If someone is constantly seeking praise or pity, don't trust them. Because they only care about themselves, but they don't understand themselves at all. It's a correlation to it. An individual who is constantly seeking your pity means they have no self-idea. They have no self-worth or self-awareness or self-perspective. They want you to create it for them. They want your pity to give them self, to give them ego. They want to build themselves upon you and what you give to them, your energy, your pity. And if someone's constantly seeking your praise, it's very similar, but on the other side. They want to build you into them. They want you to think you should be like them. That's the praise piece. Oh, praise me because I am better than you. Yes, become like me. But in the same vein, they don't understand anything about themselves because they aren't anything. Because they're relying upon you to create that. So they've given up their self, they've given up their ego, they've given up their I. So never trust anyone who's constantly seeking your praise or your pity. And if you're the type of person who's always seeking praise or pity, it's probably time you look at who you are, because you don't know. And that's okay. I'm always here to say that that's okay. It's okay not to know. It's not okay now knowing that to not try to understand yourself. That's the differentiation between willful ignorance and ignorance. It's never okay to be willfully ignorant. It's okay to be ignorant. If you just don't know, you don't know. But once you find out that there is something else, that there is an option, or there is a piece of information you can go seek out, you can go find, you can go learn, and you still want to be ignorant? Nope, that's not okay. So please go look at something that maybe you wouldn't look at. Or if you are someone who are into all these things, go look deeper. You know, if you didn't know that there's a sun sign and a moon sign, and if you knew that, maybe, okay, you knew the second, what's the rest? What's the rest of the, go delve into those things. If you're already into it, delve deeper. Always delve deeper. Oh, there's always more. There's always more. Go dive deeper. That's that leap of faith, take the deeper dive. Go look further. If you're really into fitness, if you're really into nutrition and those things, dive deeper, find out more. Macros and micros and optimal times for taking supplementation, optimal supplementation, different correlations of, how to lower inflammation in the body, that it can affect all these other different things. Dive deeper, learn more. If you're really into, I don't know, other practice, music, learn more, learn a different instrument, learn another instrument, learn, musical, like deeper musical theory, get into octaves and learning how octaves patternings and 432 hertz frequency tuning compared to 430 hertz in today's modern music, why classical music is far more moving to us than today's like crap music. Not all music's crap, but those types of things. There's always more. There's always a deeper dive. So go do it. If you're into extrasensory stuff, if you're into, start keeping a dream journal and maybe look into astral projection and lucid dreaming and those types of things. If you're into divination, if you're really into religion, if you're super into your religion, find out more about it. I'm not saying to do that just because I think you'll get away from it. No, find out more about it. Dig deeper. What's the real root? Who were these writers? Why did they write this way? Why did they think this? Like, how did they come up with this conclusion from this piece? Are there texts that I haven't read yet? What's the corresponding nature to this book to that? Like, there's always more. Dive deeper. Don't just do the surface stuff. It's not the age and time for that. It's the age and time for self and ego and to really grasp onto that. If you're super into something, I'm here to tell you to get even more into it. And that's totally okay. Fuck society if they don't think that's okay. All right? Gary Vaynerchuk, there's not enough content for everybody. There can always be more. If you're super into anime, go deep. Find more. If you're super into sports, go deep, find more. If you're super into nutrition, into fitness, as long as what you're doing isn't hurting someone else, go for it. That's really the major rule. That is the differentiation between egotistical, psychological, psychopathic nature and just being a little selfish and just having a little bit of an ego. Are you hurting someone else? Because if not, go deeper. Do you. I'm going to do me. You do you. They're going to do them. And we're all just going to be. So I'll leave you with that. Have a great day, great night, whenever you're listening to this. And I'll see you on the next one. Remember to go check out taminghindrances.com. Check out the archive. There's a bunch of stuff in there. We're always kind of trying to update it and put new stuff in there. And I'll see you on the next one. Remember, in the outro, just remember to breathe. Thanks for listening. Come check us out at taminghindrances.com for show notes, links, resources, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the show via iTunes, Stitcher, RSS, or your preferred platform. If you leave us a spiffy review, we might just mention it on the show. Now go be awesome, and just remember to breathe.